So James, your talk was very interesting because I think it kind of confirms what a lot of people think intuitively, but you are able to measure it and to put it on a better ground and to say it more precisely. And it ties in to one of the our overarching topic, centers versus margins. So small groups are in a way margins, big groups are in a way centers. We will get back to that in a minute. So I've collected here some common themes that have come up again and again in various contexts, in various talks. Common themes about innovation, or we can call it technological change, because that would also include diffusion, which, as Jesse said, might be an important nuance to consider whether we talk about the origin of something new or how it's being spread. So one of the things that came up again and again is the role of various actors, and there are two that have come up a lot. One of them is the medical doctor, the role of the doctor in medicine itself. So we talked about this phenomenon of de-intermediation, which Lawrence has brought into the discussion. So you cut out the doctor. There is no doctor-patient relationship. The sick person, the patient, or the user can make use of resources directly. That we also talked about the role of the doctor actually in innovation, not only in medicine in general, but in how new things are being created in medicine. We included also the institutions. An example was medicine without hospitals. And we talked a little bit about what the role of the doctor in innovation could be, and one example was the doctor could protect the patient against crazy new inventions. But there are a couple of other roles that the doctor traditionally fulfills, and that's one thing we could discuss now. Another one is the role of the patient or of the user, and there we have talked a lot about how much agency does a user or a patient have. Is the user or a patient more passive or more active? And in the with regards to innovation, a couple of times it came up that we discussed about the patient or the user as agents of innovation, so that the patient or the user does the innovation. Here we should probably, with the medical doctor, protection of the patient, maybe the word gatekeeper would work here. So that I saw as one complex of questions and themes that have come up, which we could discuss, which would be interesting to discuss, because the intermediation is also a phenomenon that we will be confronted in the future, as Lawrence has convincingly showed to us. The other one is this whole issue of centers and margins. And this concept, this distinction between centers and margins, and the terminology was immediately questioned, which is a very good sign. So is it useful to speak of centers and margins at all? Centers and margins could apply to the geography, where things, the place, space, where things are. It could refer to institutions, so universities, companies, individuals. It can refer to disciplines. Disciplines, something that some disciplines some areas of activity that are within medicine, others are outside of medicine. For example, it can even refer to individuals. So we used it in different ways and in the different examples. So we can talk about the usefulness or not of the categories centers and margins, and about the question, if we don't want to use those categories, what do we want to use instead? Do we just talk about different spaces, but then we need to characterize these spaces in order to get some analytical grip? There were a couple of suggestions around how to characterize these spaces. So one of them, George Weiss brought it up in a very striking way yesterday, is power. So where is the power of regulation? Where is the money? Another one was just academic versus non-academic spaces, which is much more descriptive actually. And then there is the whole aspect that this, if we talk about centers and margins, it sounds like it's static, like there are centers and there are margins, and what has brought into the discussion is that we have to think of this distinction much more dynamically, that there is a dynamic, that some places, some institutions, some people become centers, or are made centers, or become standing at the margins. So they are centered or marginalized. There are centers that are emerging. We can even talk of center building. So I thought these two complexes of issues would be worth discussing in further detail. So if anyone has comments on that and suggestions.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead? It's regarding the last part of your questions about centers and margins, and it is a thought that I had while listening to your talk, Summer. Because I think I agree with you, because yesterday you suggested that those two categories have limitations, and it was maybe better to think about centering rather than center. And I was thinking, when you were saying that most of the innovation in medicine occurs in the periphery, and that the centers tend almost to prevent or to condition innovation rather than innovate, so why do we call the periphery and the center? So if most innovation occurs in what you think is the periphery now, so maybe it's no longer the periphery and it has become the center of innovation. And I guess there could be maybe two solutions to this conundrum. I guess one of them would be approaching center and periphery as actors' categories. And I think that would align with what you suggested yesterday of talking about centering rather than center. So even though even though most innovation happens in what was considered to be the periphery, then thinking about themselves as periphery still conditions their actions, even though it is where most innovation is occurring. So that would be one possibility. And another possibility would be, and I think it aligns what you were saying, Thomas, about dynamics of centers and margins, to think about the historicity of those categories. And maybe it was the periphery, but it is no longer the periphery. And it was the center, but it is no longer the center. But even, and that's maybe why they are preventing innovation in the center, even if it's no longer the center of innovation, because they have been the center before, they still keep the power. So they still have the power, even though the center has moved somewhere else. So I think this could be ways in which we can use those categories, I think, more fruitfully for me, because if you take them as static and an analytical rather than actors categories, I'm not that persuaded by them.
Yes, I'm also just thought about these categories, and George Weiss also was skeptical yesterday, I remember. I think they are somehow very useful categories if somebody is working, especially on this, how innovations work on and so on and so forth. I was thinking also about what Summer yesterday said about what we were just talking about, and it sounds like center is something and periphery is also something. But this is probably a prejudice, but thinking about the US, we have certain centers, New York, Chicago, but you have a large periphery. So it makes sense that most of the innovations come from the periphery, because periphery is something very, you have a center which is a very condensed space, and the periphery is everything else. So it's not surprising that a lot of new things come from the periphery, because periphery is much more larger than the center. And the second thing is, also referring to your point, the second thing is we have also talked about that, or you, especially in your paper, Sama, that often within the center things are invented, and then all the group is thinking about this and that and so on and so forth, and then it's spread over. But problems arise in the periphery, because here you have all the difficulties. And thinking about Hans-Jörg Reinberger, for instance, when happens something new? This is if there is a disruption between a certain innovation, and then you have a difference between what was going on, and you could not think about all the different problems that might arise. And within the periphery, then you have, so to say, the problems arise because you haven't thought about it in the center, that this or that might happen, a certain side effect of a disease, and so on and so forth. So I think we have probably to recalibrate of our idea of a periphery as something opposing to the center, but periphery is everything else, and you have a center within the...
If you do that, you have a very different definition of center from McGill's. So your definition is a function of innovation, and that I would not suggest using, because that's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you want to use it as an analytic category, you have to get new criteria, other criteria than innovation itself for defining them, or use it as an actors category, actually. James? I don't. You want to go first?
Okay, just briefly, just to respond, to me, when I thought about the last day and a half, perhaps we can think of centers and margins as really being two different headspaces, because you can have a company like Apple, which one would think of as being the center, but within Apple itself, there are margins. I mean, the Macintosh computer came out of a company that wasn't thinking about making the Macintosh computer, because the user interface was totally different from what came before, the Apple I, the Apple II, whatever. And the company prides itself on destroying its previous iteration of products. So within the company, within the centrality of Apple, you've got margins of or sparks of innovation that the company allows to flourish and promotes. I guess Google, you could argue, would be the same thing. So maybe centers and margins are really headspaces, and they could actually be in the same physical space, but represent two different headspaces.
But then you define margin and center again as a function of being innovative or not. It's a possibility.
And still there is a hierarchy, because it is true what the professor said. Let's take the institution that many people write about in this common knowledge. Let's take Harvard, let's say. Within Harvard, of course, there are different kinds of minds, but still, even those minds that could be considered by stereotypical definition margins, they still belong to Harvard. Therefore, in the normal discourse, they would be still considered centers. So we are coming back at this. I personally think, perhaps because of my background in ancient history and early modern history, in those periods there is an enormous literature. There were numerous centers. There were multi-centers of both innovation as well as conservative view, if we want to call it that way. So, Madrid and London, they were centers for two different things. No?
Yeah.
And for different disciplines, allowing to have this multi-centrality. I think that we could use these multi-centers. Problem is also the nomenclature, center. No.
Talk about the nomenclature. Until
So I think one thing. I mean, it's not obvious. I think truly within a place like Apple, you can't have centers and peripheries, not just in terms of the function, but just in terms of airtime to the C-suite, resources, etc. So I think that it wasn't obvious to me that you're just describing a functional space. That
No, I wasn't describing.
Yeah, I feel like you weren't describing something that was in terms of. But that being said, I would hesitate for us to think about there to be a conservation of centerness and peripheryness in every network, because there's truly not, right? So there's some highly centralized networks in which there truly is no periphery. So everybody's highly networked in this space, and I think this is precisely the greatest risk in this world of expanding centers, right? So we're going to give you more resources to connect more of your persons to more of the information. We're going to lock them into, because the impact of that, it's not just that we have some conserved periphery that's just always out there. There's an equal percentage of people that are at the periphery and the center. Mathematically and functionally, that's simply not the case. And there's some places which are highly centralized and others which aren't. And I would say in the web era, in the high, transportation and communication technology era, we do have a driving down of the periphery. And I think that that's problematic with respect to innovation, right? So more and more actors are kind of, in some sense, contaminated with each other's information. It was kind of like the drug gene study. More and more people are aware of more and more papers as a function of digital access. They have more and more access to precise protocols that other people do, and the potential is that we can learn more and more about less and less. Right? So, which is to say, we're performing experiments, but we're not performing broad replications. We're performing precise reproductions. And if that effect sits on some ridge, when it shows up in the clinic, it's not likely to be on top of that ridge. We're not likely to see the same effect. So I think there is also a cost which is associated with just the demarginalization of. There's of course benefits too. There's resources, there's information. The whole system can hill climb, and that's in fact what we see. We see enormous swarming effects in science that increase in recent years in all areas of biomedical and biochemical science. And we had a paper a couple of years ago in PNAS that kind of showed this concentration, which has an effect. One other, this is self-indulgent, but it is, with respect to these, I'm running a little experiment now, and I don't really know what the outcome should be, so I'm kind of curious if anyone has a take on this. So we're looking at drug repurposing. So we've got about 700 drug repurposings through phase 4 clinical trials, and I'm trying to see the degree to which. So I'm that I'm taking for a collection of insurance records which capture about 47% of U.S. patient-doctor interactions. I'm basically embedding diseases and treatments as a function of the likelihood that they're seen by the same physician in a given week, right? So there are all these new neural network approaches where you can embed these in some high-dimensional space, and the distance ends up being highly predictive of true distances in the world, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, what's the likelihood that those things that are seen by tertiary care elite physicians end up getting repurposed faster across conditions than those that are captured by secondary physicians, by tertiary care physicians, by things that are kind of closer or further from that periphery. And I'm just, no one has to answer, but if anybody has a hypothesis about what the difference will be, so I already know that there's a signal. I already know that basically things that are close in the space, which is to say that if they're likely to show up in the same patient, they're likely to show up within the doctor's same week, are more likely to be repurposed much quicker than those that are further. But I'm just about to split out center and periphery. So I'd be curious if you have hypotheses about geography, institution, discipline, etc., because I'm just about to run that experiment, basically. I mean, on a retrospective experiment, and I don't have the right priors. I'd really, anyway, my two thoughts.
I know.
Not directly linking up to this, but indirectly, and having the last two talks in mind, I would rather suggest to look at centers and peripheries again from a traditional institutional view, especially if we look at innovation from a network perspective. And next limitation, if we look at it from an academic perspective. Academic centers come along with a lot of symbolic capital and a lot of resources. It is the thing in these, if you follow the concept of thought styles, in these academic centers, that the moment they have been innovative, they become conservative in order to protect what they just invented. But here is, from my perspective, where symbolic capital and resources come into play. The real strong centers have, and that's maybe why it takes 15 years, the real strong centers have the capacity of renovating their brains once in a while by attracting people from what was perceived in institutional settings as periphery before. And so they steadily acquire innovation. But the innovations they acquire has been, because of the time lag, already selected, proven, and is on the verge of becoming conservative. And this is, from my perspective, what makes the center the center. They do not have to bother with all the unsuccessful attempts at finding something. They collect what has been established. Think of animal models. You can test 1,000 animals until you find that zebrafish and mice are, well, they work. And the real center is able to jump on the train before it's too late, but when it's already established. So at least for the academic setting, I would say that this, well, evolutionary concept of selection helps them to survive, because they, as I just said, take the chance of getting knowledge that is not that new, but not that old, and still it links up with what is there, but offers new potential. Maybe this causes a time lag, but has again to do with resources and symbolic capital. And this final word, this of course is in the end, well, as Merton says, it's the Matthew effect and a reward system. Once you're in the center, you really have to fail for a long time to lose this status. I think the University of Heidelberg can do whatever it wants. It will stay one of the centers for the next 50 years, although it's in the middle of nowhere because of all this capitalization.
Or will it come up with technological change?
Yeah.
Things for technological change? Question mark.
So, building on Reiner's comment, and I appreciate this. So when we think about some of the leading universities, or I'm thinking of Harvard, but possibly Chicago is the same way. They often, so it seems stodgy and stale, and everybody achievements are kind of often behind them, present company excluded. But the institutions do have a way to renew themselves, and definitely they go out and seek these people at the margin who have done interesting work, new work, and then they bring them in at a full professor level, which is atypical in many US or Canadian universities, or at least it's not as done as frequently. At Harvard is the principal way, or the primary way they which they recruit talent. There's the occasional person who goes in from the within, but that's how. But for me, that's a strategy that the institution takes to avoid the staleness problem, right? Which is often the case. So, on the concept of core periphery, center periphery, I think one thing we can. I don't have data for it, but possibly we can reduce the importance of geography, because nowadays in the modern world, knowledge travels more easily than it used to. Doesn't mean know-how travels as easily, but at least the codified knowledge is available to almost anyone on the planet with the skills to get to it. So it's less of that. So I would be more inclined to go toward an institutional, but even more a social explanation, a social field explanation of the landscape, of the geography. So it is, there may be multiple centers, definitely there are. They're not the same because power comes into it, specialization, influence. So it's a multipolar or multi-peaks kind of landscape. So maybe the simple image that we get from center periphery is one center and like a center of a circle and a circle, people on the periphery. Maybe that's not the right image we want to project. We want to project something much more complicated. So there was a mention of the rhizome before, that it's not predictable where the innovation will come from. It's all possible. It's possible almost anywhere, but at the end, one shoot goes up here, one shoot goes up there, and it looks random, but it's not really random. So these are ideas which I think are possibly can help get us out of the center-periphery debate.
I think of the center as experience in some ways, and the periphery as aspirational maybe, and I believe that's a way to sort of look at it, considering corporations and their experience, and they go through enough to know not to take on something they've already experienced as being wrong for them, for instance.
Let me just segue from the kind of the strategy literature. Our colleague Henry Mintzberg talks about emergent strategy, and I just finished a book on millennials. So the argument is that my experience from IBM from 25 years ago is largely irrelevant today. Not entirely, you still get stabbed in the back like I did at IBM, and you do that at McGill, well, not at McGill, but it's sort of thing that happens. But this is before the internet, before I didn't have an email. That's how long ago it was. So students mock me, rightly so. So what I'm arguing is that I make strategy as a senior person, but increasingly I've got to listen to the boundary spanners who have a foot in the turbulent world and a foot in our organization. So as a senior, and I've interviewed about 350 senior executives for Millennials book, a book I'm doing on introverted leaders, and one of the conversations they make is almost to a person, they listen more than they used to as you get more senior, and they listen more today to millennials than they did. So when I was mentored a long time ago, it was 98% one way. Today, I'm reverse mentored 25% of the time by my 5, 20, 21-year-old undergraduate students. And so I'm older than most of you, and my workforce is younger than yours unless you work at a McDonald's. So I have a very young workforce that I'm being reverse mentored by, partly because I need to learn from them. So the CEO and the senior people make the strategy, there's some good research at MIT on millennials that you must listen to them, but they allow you to make the decision. So there's two different issues there. So the periphery, you might argue, are millennials, where we're the core because we're boomers or whatever, Generation X or whatever we are, that we're somewhat in charge, and I don't disagree with Mike and Larry and Tom being in charge, like we're comfortable with that thought, Sammer and so on. But we need to listen more to the periphery, that is young people. Also, I'm looking at introverts and extroverts, where traditionally extroverts myself are in charge, but the introverts are about half of senior executives. So an introvert is a bit on the periphery in the sense that they are not as the center of things. They're great listeners. They tend to speak towards the end of a meeting. So it just strikes me as two things I'm working on. They're more peripheral, young people and introverts. But from a viewpoint of effective strategy, to be a good capitalist, to make a lot of money, you need to listen to them more than the past. That's the argument that strikes me through all this.
But still, there is a clear hierarchy. You repeated a couple of times, I absolutely need to be mentored by the millennial. However, they are on the periphery.
They could be viewed as on the periphery. Maybe that's probably what we're stating it. In the
that
sense
can
that
be
there
viewed.
are employees or half our workforce increasingly are middle management. So a middle manager is not on the periphery way out here, but they may not be as listened to. But I'm arguing in today's world we need to listen to them more. And so they're more central than periphery, but I'm playing with words there in a way. But see, the MIT research said the younger people are happy for us older people to make decisions because we have experience. We also have the titles. We're also held accountable. So if it goes bad, they call Thomas in, not his research assistant. So it's something where younger people are happy for us to take the flack as well. So it's not entirely nice of them, but it's a happy thought that I have to listen, but they're not going to say, "Oh, you didn't follow my advice. I'm really ticked off." They go, "Hey, you didn't follow my advice, but you paid attention to it, and you don't favor one person, but you listen to a bunch of ideas." Part of it is they'll say black and white, and I can't do both, so I've got to decide. But they're relatively happy to let older, senior people decide. I don't know if that makes sense. Are you happier?
Well,
Happy is a strong word. You are European.
that is also a complicated word.
Didn't mean to bring up the Brexit. So.
Extremely in terms of periphery and centrality.
Yeah.
Extremely. I don't know. I still think that because this polarization in early modern history has been used. Actually, it is a paradigm, no? To me, as soon as we use the word center, everything that we do not include in the perimeter, we have to define it. So we can define peripheral to, we can define marginal, but peripheral to what? Marginal to what? And vice versa.
It's clearly a relational term, center and periphery. If you create a center, you create at the same time periphery.
Yeah, because that also comes from early study in astronomical models. Yeah.
Or the other way around.
Yes, but still there is this relational.
Yeah. James.
So, forgive me, it's like a two-person lag. Like, I'm responding partly to the conversation that was happening before about the idea of the successful center, whatever that means. But from my perspective, I'm not talking about in terms of innovation. I'm talking about in terms of attention, capitals of attention, money, power, etc. And recruiting people, who become successful, recruiting this periphery that they couldn't have incubated, right? Because they couldn't have undertaken those risks. I was chatting with the head of Microsoft research a couple weeks ago, and he was telling a colleague of mine, Duncan Watts, he was like, I want you to come up with the next WhatsApp, you know? And he was like that would be the worst possible strategy that we could do. You know, because like how many, like thousands of kind of like lookalike WhatsApps failed, one succeeded through, you know, it's completely unclear exactly what the pathway of you know, its virality, its relative virality. And so the idea for the center to invest actually, like in all these kind of potentially failed projects, I mean, it's unsustainable. I mean, it's unsustainable for them to maintain their budget model, basically, and get that return, and so they buy, you know? So, you know, do you make or buy? They buy instead of make. But it's like that, you know, that has consequences, right? Because then you have a place that only buys, right? Which is to say that, you know, there might be consequences for these places which, you know, are the center of power and resources with respect to, for example, research. But, you know, they're always buying people and conferring attention and resources on people who are no longer making innovations, right? And we can, you know, can show this on average. It's not like nobody comes up with 2 Nobel Prizes. You know, there are 3 people, you know, 1 in, you know, physics and, you know, so the vast majority of people who have their hit, it's over. Like they don't make another hit. You know, there's about 15% of people who have another big hit after they had their first hit relative to their career. So I think I certainly see this happening. It's definitely in the center's interest to recruit successful periphery, but it ends up kind of also having this depressive effect on investment innovation, because it's still drawing resources to itself to not innovate.
Right? Bristol Myers did that. Bristol Myers Products back in the 90s decided they weren't going to do any real inventing work inside, and they were buying up small companies that were coming up with new things.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't have to do with their, for instance, their diabetes research or that kind of department, but it was just the products that wound up in consumer products, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was a decision by the company itself to do that, to stop doing any more work on new
It's a
products.
rational decision under some circumstances.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And a director?
Yes, let me just be a little bit more precise. It is not my impression that if an innovation is made somewhere, a technical innovation, that the centers, the university centers, for example, and this is of course not fitting any of the stories that has been told, they do not buy the people who made the invention.
They do.
And if they
I can
do,
show you.
it's okay. But the in other cases, for example, the guys in Australia were still in Western Australia long after the Helicobacter was invented. They were never hired in Düsseldorf University or somewhere, no, in Oxford or whatever. But the centers have, for example, big university centers have the possibility of hiring the next generation of applicants, the people who successfully applied this technology, and then they can hire. Of course, I think you're right. There are universities in the academic setting, again, and maybe this applies also for technological change, that are universities that only hire people older than 55 years old, but they do this is my hypothesis, and network studies can show that, to acquire the students. It's not so much that they want these people to be innovative again, but they have an innovation which was successful and they want the next generation, and they have the symbolic and real capital to do so. This is my impression. And it fits with your data in a way, that science is conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I think I disagree, but I think it's okay. We can. I like, it's okay. We can.
Yeah, and you have the data. I just have smaller empiric experience. So.
No, I'm not asking for deference. I'm not asking for deference. I'm just, Just, I mean, I think it's a great. It's an empirical question. Is to the degree to which they hire the bodies that made, those advances that come to have, conferred advance. But I think the consequence could be relatively similar, right? Whether or not I'm hiring this person after they've made their invention, or I'm hiring their students who have bought into something that's made it, the relative, consequence of that may be the same, which is that we're drawing resources to last year's.
And the centers have the possibility of hiring 5 or 6 different innovations that prove to be successful in first place, and then they can test the next step, which is the most effective. And this is a possibility. Let's stick to universities. Peripheral universities do not have. This is also the chance when you just buy enough, one apple will be okay. At least people hope so.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
I feel what are we talking about? So this is just all the time.
Oh my gosh!
No.
You said that aloud, actually.
No. But this is what I would think when we are talking about centers and margins. And I was just thinking about some of the illustrations we have seen and what centers, what margins, to what relation, and I mean this is all dependent. When we are talking about centers and margins, we have to define it. And we have to define the relations to each other, multi-center for sure. Also, and this is what I want really to make very, very strong. These are some sort of a snapshot, so to say. This is not only it depends on the perspective, but also on the time perspective. About what period are we talking when we're talking about centers, one center, several centers? What is the perspective? What we are looking at? Are we looking about certain institutions, certain innovations? How have they been invented, and so on and so forth? And then all is dependent on this question. So we could discuss for a couple of hours about all the different things, but I think when we are thinking and talking about centers and margins, it all depends on this. Do we mean some sort of geographical? Do we mean actions? Do we? And this is, I think, very central, so to say, to the question when we are talking about and what is the role, for instance, of users within this innovation, or the role of the doctor. I mean, this all depends on what we are talking about. So, and this is, I think, should be very. For instance, your historians always have the problem. It's this micro and macro problem, so to say. If you have a very small, so to say, analysis of a group of people, then everything is so tiny and complicated and so multi-perspective and multiple layers and so on and so forth. And the more you take, though, the more, I would say, differences you just ignore and so on. So it's with EBM medicine, so there are a lot of problems with statistics and all this stuff. So this is some sort of problem, how to define certain categories. And for instance, if you have certain, especially in these groups, you have a certain number of groups, but probably a person is just within these groups is switching from one institution to another. So you have, all this is changing, and it's not always the same group when you're, for instance, comparing groups of publication and so on. So I think, and this is what I mean, we're talking about over time, even though a year or two depends on the question. So everything is, so to say, changing within this discussion about margin and periphery as networks, so to say, it's exactly the same.
From business school, small view of the world, if the periphery creates more innovation, the central question, since the business school will be part of the center, how do we bring that in without ruining them? And this is what the Silicon Valley seems particularly good at times, is doing that. So it may be different from medical school, but from the business school, that's one of the very practical issues we look at. Because we'd accept that there's lots of stuff happening in the periphery, but the center, like the big pharma companies have huge numbers of sales reps, they can reach the world, where a 10-person firm in Montreal can't reach the world. Therefore, we should let them invent and bring it in and spread it to the world through the big pharma firms. So that's a central tension I would see, and that's from a practical viewpoint some of the things we want to do. But how do you bring them in without ruining them? And you see that in Silicon Valley. You bring in these small companies, and often the senior person leaves because you make a vice president, give them an office, but they hate going to meetings. They hate having a boss, and you know they're going to leave, but you hope that the ideas and a bunch of their people stay. And how do you manage Google so you don't tick off the really creative people is a central issue when I go down and talk to them, it seemed to be about. And the IT, Samer's one of the world's experts on this, IT is just changing the world, which he would agree with, but I think it's actually true, that it's really changing the role, the periphery, and ability to access and these things. There's some very interesting dynamics going on.
So building on this point, if you take, there's something that has happened accidentally in Canada, which put Canada on the map in terms of one technology, which is artificial intelligence. I don't know if you guys know the story, but artificial intelligence had gone down a certain path, a certain cognitivist path, trying to represent the world and kind of have machines learn these representations to be able to act in the world. And that has been the story of AI over the last 50 years. And someone forgot to tell some bureaucrats in a Canadian scientific agency, and they kept funding this alternative model of doing AI through neural nets. And this was perceived or shown to be an inferior technique for a number of years, and most centers of AI research in the US and the world had not pushed on it. In Canada, for a number of reasons, there were some people who came here with the idea to push resilience. Gregory Hinton in Toronto is the father of kind of Canadian neural net research. He has had students, and that matters very much. These students have moved on to Montreal and to other places. And suddenly this technique that they had been pushing, due to a variety of technical innovations in other fields, became feasible and outperformed the traditional approach. So I would say it's an accidental development, but in innovation it's all about accidents, fortuitous accidents. And so to unify the stories here, the Googles of the world and the Facebooks, they came in and took those star researchers and students, and LeCun, is a student for Gregory Hinton, he's
Jeff
now running. Yeah. So these guys are so the Silicon Valley did the strategy of let's go grab these rising stars, right? But on back home here, the Canadian government has been struggling with what to do with this accidental, on the cheap arrival, creation of a center, right? They are now central to AI research in the world. They don't have a huge advantage. It could disappear any moment. So the reaction of the federal government and the local government is to pour in money, hundreds of millions of dollars to create centers of excellence here, so they don't lose all the key people to Silicon Valley or wherever. And so these, I think, are the two things, which is you can build centers where it makes sense, and you can push that, centers of excellence. So we talked yesterday about the Schlich Hospital. There are places that benefit from this strategy of building centers on, like, I'm not sure Schlich set up. It was it was meant to be that what it became, right? I think over time it kind of evolved in it. So I don't know. Does this hospital want to be a certain kind of center? Like, can you strategize and focus your efforts and say we're going to be this kind of centers? Because the cost is that you may miss out on other things, and you make the wrong bet, right? So these are the issues, I think, which makes this very difficult.
Well, that's the danger when you have the government controlling, in this case, healthcare. Because then the government starts to decide what kind of center you should be, whether that's good or bad or right or wrong. But it's clear you can't do everything. And so you're right, if you choose to do this and not that, you might be betting on the wrong horse, so to speak, which is more likely to happen than not. So, I mean, the strategy that I've taken here in this organization is that since it's impossible to really know where anything is going, what we should strive to do is to provide the absolute best care that can be provided anywhere, regardless of what specialty the care may be in. And that, I guess, makes us a specialist in the provision of high quality care, which a lot of people don't talk about. That may surprise you. You can go to a lot of places and not hear anybody talk about high quality care. You can talk about timely access, you hear talk about volume, you hear talk about the star performers. It says nothing about the provision of high quality care. And it brings me back to the government, because in Canada we have a single payer. And that would be okay if it really was a single payer, but every province has its own health plan, and every province spends its money differently with its own priorities. Here in Quebec, when they blew up the healthcare system 3 years ago, and they literally did blow it up, they fired every single CEO in the province. And then you had to reapply for your job back. They overnight did a major transformation, which was structural. And I remember being at a meeting of all the new CEOs and the minister and the deputy minister, and he presented this plan and why he did it, and it made some good sense. But then I picked up my hand and I said to him, what about the quality of care? I said, you've said nothing about the quality of care. And he was honest and candid enough to say, not in this term.
Wow.
So there's an election in October. We'll see if they get reelected and if he's still the health minister. But that's the problem in healthcare when you politicize healthcare. So I would never go out on a limb and say we're going to do this or we're not going to do that. But whatever it is we're doing, we should be the best at.
So I think, at least to me, one of the things that's highlighted here, I think with Jeff Hinton and his group, is the fact that it was important that they were in Canada. It was important that they were disconnected from the AI winter. It was important that they didn't read Marvin Minsky's book on the perceptron. And I think that's to me at least part of the story is that at one level, one of the reasons why I think we see scientists behaving as conservatively as we do individually, and I'd like to understand more about physicians with respect to treatment regimes and what have you, is because they're managing a portfolio of, in some cases, one. Like they put in a grant, a proposal, and the proposal is reviewed on its merits. So they actually don't have the ability to maintain a portfolio of risk. If you were to ask, venture capitalists, so, do you want everything to succeed? No. You want a failure rate of like 80%. You have to have, if you're going to manage your ecosystem, as both of you were suggesting about this huge, enormous periphery, if you're going to manage your periphery, then you have to expect and even push for a high failure rate. And so, and frankly, the larger you get, in theory, the more active you should be at spreading your bets, right? Like non-correlating your bets. I mean, if you have a lot of money, you don't put it all in, one small cap stock. You spread it over anti-correlated sectors of the market, over anti-cyclical businesses, et cetera. And I think that's one of the things that I'm not seeing, certainly in the U.S. health investment space. And so it requires things like a country boundary, where you got two disconnected groups to create a global portfolio of, and even then, it's often not successful. But I think this idea, what does Canada do to keep that edge? I don't think there's anything they can do to keep that edge. I mean, that is, there's a tidal wave, and that was enormously successful, and was successful for the universe. That they did that. Part of the global portfolio was critical that they were disconnected from that system. And it was critical that they were periphery, in that particular sense. And so I think, finding ways to actually maintain some disconnection in this era of, connection and, like centers reaching out and like constant communication and is, I don't know, to me at least that's a part of the story, because I think in some ways we take this periphery for granted. We talk about it as a kind of a less resourced space. We think of it as and yet at the same time, it is, like it's the future, so finding ways to maintain that future at national levels, at international levels, within institutions, et cetera, I think is critical, but it requires a different way of thinking about risk.
So James, if we believe your findings, then the Canadian government should not be spending $800 million on building AI centers in Canada, but rather investing it in a completely different industry or different industries, and they will be better served because they're not going to have the next hit. The AI revolution that Canada was part of has happened, and you're not going to be able to outcompete Silicon Valley. And so bet on something different, which is the opposite of what natural strategists and managers tend to do. This is our success. This is something good. We're going to build it.
The firm, I'm talking from a global innovation perspective. So of course, the manager of the firm is going to want to maintain the relative benefit of the firm. All I'm saying is that it's necessarily at the cost of global innovation, necessarily. So it's like if everybody is basically trying to hedge against their risk, then the global portfolio is going to be enormously correlated. And that's what we see in the sciences, is we see this flocking, and we did an analysis just to see, okay, what if we just looked at, combinations of chemicals across a whole host of spaces over about 70 years. And we said, what if we took an approach that built a model that kind of did the best job of predicting what eventually was published, right? So not even something that hadn't been done, but exactly what it was that was done. And you could basically find an algorithm that did it in effectively 1/10 of the time. And the reason was because of this enormous flocking around, the same sets of interactions, most of which, some of which succeeded, some of which failed. The failures weren't published. So other people would do them over again and over again and over again, hundreds of times, and you can actually estimate the relative likelihood that those things had been experimented and not published. And so I think it definitely flies in the face of if you're trying to maximize, your personal benefit or your kind of corporate benefit, then it puts at risk the diversity of the portfolio for the collective, right, at each level. And I think that's so we need to reallocate incentives in certain kinds of ways so that we actually value group level, portfolio level productivity rather than individual center, organization productivity. Or we're always, going to be chasing the same taillights.
Kind of an ecological approach to innovation, in a way, which I find it's a good endpoint of our discussion. So it shows us, gives us a new perspective also on the question of periphery and center. So periphery is something that needs to be protected or even created in a way, and that there is value in separating off certain areas and so to create the possibility of new things coming up. I'm over-interpreting, maybe exaggerating.
That's good interpretation.
thank you very much. I found it very enjoyable and interesting. I would like to give the last word to Lawrence.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming to Montreal and to this institution. It's been a real pleasure having you all here. I think the last 2 days have been extremely interesting and stimulating. And I look forward to interacting with you in the future. This is a subject that's not going to go away. And it's, I say that speaking as a physician and as a CEO of a healthcare institution. I think this whole notion of de-intermediation or disintermediation in healthcare is going to be an extremely important topic for the next few years, especially as AI really begins to enter medicine, which it hasn't yet really. And the marriage of AI, medical devices, and clinical medicine is going to lead to a revolution that nobody really has foreseen. So thank you.
Thank you.